Hello there. Kind of an impromptu one now. I am going to be speaking to Aaron Kimberly, who is a trans man who's had a pretty unpleasant experience recently. I'm kind of learning as I go on this one. It's kind of like a developing situation. So let's just dive in and we'll get Aaron on and we will see what's happening. Hi, Aaron. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Despite what's happening, I'm good.
Yeah. Where am I speaking to you? Where to you today? Where are you based?
I'm in British Columbia, Canada.
Right. Yes. I did.
Across the pond.
Yes, indeed. Now, Aaron. First of all, can you tell me a little bit about your background and who you are, and any details of your activism to date?
Sure. Yeah, so I am a trans man. As you mentioned, I transitioned about 15 years ago. And since then, I've just kind of been quietly living my life. And I have been a registered nurse for about that long as well, for about 15 years. And specializing in mental health. So I've worked in various different settings, like hospital psychiatric units, and then more recently in the community, and I was until fairly recently working with youth at a clinic, for multidisciplinary clinic for youth. We did primary care, mental health care, a bunch of different things all under one roof. And that's when I sort of re-entered the whole trans. I mean, I didn't even know that it was necessarily a debate back then, but just the whole trans discourse, I guess, because I've been out of the loop for quite some time, living in the middle of nowhere and living my life, as I said, and our clinic was starting to do some trans care. We had quite a number of youth coming in wanting to start hormones, and in our community there weren't a lot of services to do that, and the demand was such that our physicians were having trouble keeping up. And because it's something that I have experienced myself, I thought the learning curve for me would be pretty small, and I could get up to speed with how things are done these days and help our physicians out. So I was helping to coordinate services and helping them with assessment. And that's when I started to know things have changed a lot in the last 15 years in terms of how that trans care work is being done and how the whole trans experience is being conceptualized.
Right. And what would you say, what kind of was the major difference you were seeing in the kids who were coming in and comparing that with your own experience?
Yeah, so some of that was information I was getting from the youth, but most of it, I mean, most of the kids coming in, I got a sense were coming in for different reasons. You know, when they were talking about that experience, that's the nice thing working with young people, is they didn't necessarily come in, you know, having already been immersed in a trans culture or in trans ideology. I mean, some had definitely picked the politics up, but the vast majority of the young people hadn't. So they were just coming in with their raw experience, which is what I really loved about working with them. So most of my concern was actually coming from the training that I'm receiving in contact with the trans care system, the healthcare system. And, you know, because I guess I'm still stuck in, you know, the old guard way of thinking about this. So when I transitioned, I had been in the gay and lesbian community for a long time. Prior to that, I came out as a teenager, as a young person, as a lesbian. And when I moved to the city, I grew up in a small little isolated farming community. There was no gay and lesbian community there to speak of, which, looking back, I think is a part of how my gender dysphoria developed, but we don't have to get into all those details. But moved to the city, became an active part of the lesbian community, and at that time was starting to understand my gender dysphoria. I didn't know what to call it back then. I just felt like I was a boy in some way. Was starting to make sense of that in the context of being a lesbian, because a lot of the gay and lesbian people that I were meeting has similar experiences. They're very butch lesbians and more effeminate gay men. And so I was starting to understand that as this is just a part, for a lot of us, a part of the gay and lesbian experience. It's something that some gay and lesbian people experience, and it gets integrated into a gay and lesbian identity. And so I was starting to make sense of it that way. And then as I got older, I started to hear more about this thing called gender identity disorder. And a lot of people in the community, like the butch lesbians that I was hanging out with, said, well, this is the name for this thing that I'm experiencing. But I still thought of it as a gay and lesbian experience.
Right, right.
And we talked about it in terms of this is something, this is a disorder of some kind, or a cognitive process or a developmental process, or however we wanted to make sense of that. It was a disorder of some kind, and that's how we understood it. And then some people started to transition, but a lot of them still remained within the gay and lesbian community. Trans men were still socializing with butch lesbians, and so that's how I understood it. As I got older and in my early 30s, that was sort of from a community perspective how I was seeing it. That there were butch lesbians, and then there were these FDM trans men, but I didn't see them as completely different sexes or completely different creatures. I just saw them as they made two different choices and how they managed that experience.
Right, and so obviously you kind of you don't what's the word? You don't ignore the reality of your situation. You're very much reality based in how you look at your dysphoria and how you see your transition. How did you see that changing amongst people you were speaking to and in the wider LGBT community?
Yeah, so when I started doing the clinical work and trying to, in earnest learn how to do that work well, questions about the diagnosis, how do we make this diagnosis, and making sense of it as a condition. I thought, well, we're clinicians, and when we meet as a community of practice, we're going to talk and think like clinicians. So asking about what is our current understanding of gender identity disorder, or now called gender dysphoria, what is our understanding of what that is, and how are we measuring outcomes, those kinds of, that way of clinical thinking didn't seem to be happening really within the community of practice. I mean, it was in terms of how do I titrate this, hormone, or managing the medical aspects of it, but in terms of understanding what is gender dysphoria from a clinical framework, that's what's completely changed. And some of those same clinicians, I was reading some of their peer-reviewed papers 20 years ago, and they were doing some really smart things, case studies of working with people with autogynephilia and some of the successes they were having in that. And so these were some of the same people. So I was still talking to them as though they were still thinking that way. And I wasn't aware that they weren't really thinking of this as a disorder of any kind anymore, that they're now it's this gender identity framework where everyone has a gender identity, and there's this diversity amongst gender identity. And so I just don't understand because I agree with that to some extent, that there is diversity within, there are lots of different ways to be a girl, lots of different ways to be a boy, that we get to present differently and express ourselves differently. I totally agree with that. But this idea that gender dysphoria isn't a medical or psychiatric condition of any kind, that this is just diversity, and yet there's this rush to medicalize it as fast as possible, or else people are going to kill themselves. Like, so much of that narrative isn't making any sense to me as a trans person or a clinician.
Yeah, it's directly contradictory, isn't it? I mean, it seems to me that for the kind of ideologues in this, it's gender dysphoria when they want it to be, and it's nothing to do with dysphoria when they want that. Would you say that? And would you like? It seems to me that it seems to have been politicized, and I'm not sure what the other word is. Ideologicized, I guess. It seems to be an ideology now rather than than people really trying to help people, really trying to sort out the conflicts in their mind that lead to dysphoria.
Yeah, and I'm recognizing a lot of that because, I mean, as a young person in my 20s, back in the early 90s, I took some queer theory classes, and some of those classes, they at the time were interesting to me, and as a lesbian, and a lot of talk about lesbian masculinity. And so that language appealed to me, but I quickly learned that the way that a lot of those theories are constructed, though they do have their place and have some appeal, the nature of postmodernism is deconstructive. And the whole queer theory project, you know, when you read like Foucault talking about how the oppressor, if you want to think of it that way, defined what a homosexual is in order to identify a target to oppress. So
Right.
the whole idea of queer theory as a political movement has been about, let's make sure we blur all those boundaries. We want to make sure that people can't identify these clearly defined groups so that they can't target and oppress them. And so it's all about creating this perpetual kind of smoke and mirrors show that blurs the boundaries between things like male and female or gay and straight, with the idea that that would somehow be liberating for us, and that we could kind of hide in a way from targets of abuse and oppression.
Sure.
by doing that. So I'm recognizing, and I've long left behind those theories, seeing that because they're meant to be destabilizing and deconstructive, when we apply that to gender dysphoria, which is already kind of confusing and a destabilizing experience as a condition, you combine those two, I was finding it was making my gender dysphoria a lot worse. So I left behind those theories, not seeing them as useful for me as an individual, but I'm recognizing that language being used in the clinical world to explain what gender dysphoria is. And so it concerns me that the clinical world is no longer seeing this from a scientific lens. They're seeing it through a queer theory lens, and a lens that actually made my dysphoria worse.
Yeah. If I may quote you, I have a piece that you contributed to, or perhaps wrote. It's the targeted harassment blog that you wrote, where you talk about the political and conceptual stance of gender ideology and so on, and you say you have a list of things that you find are damaging about it. And they include that it seeks to coerce us into disassociating from our sexed bodies, which is psychological harm. It seeks to coerce us into denying the truth of our lived experiences. It seeks to create division between us and our families and communities. It seeks to undermine sex-based rights, particularly for women. It seeks to undermine the rights of gay and lesbian people who are same-sex attracted. And it is fueling increased hostility towards LGBT and T people. Now, how did you arrive at the stage where you decided to join together? I know you're working with Buck Angel and a few others. What made you take that leap into actual activism?
Well, there was a point where, you know, just I tried to push back on this or question it or critique it within the clinical community. And there seemed to be some that were in agreement. There were definitely people who messaged me privately and said that, you know, they thanked me for saying what I was saying and how brave it was that I was saying it. And at the time, I didn't realize I was being brave, because I just kind of walked in here thinking that things were still being done as they were 15, 20 years ago, and wasn't trying to be political, and stumbled upon this landmine rather by accident. So, and then I received quite a bit of backlash and hostility from certain members of the clinical community who were acting as though I had just, you know, committed some awful sin within the community. So that started to concern me. Is really, and meanwhile I was digging into the medical literature because I was just so confused about how did this happen, and why did this major shift happen over the last 15 years, and trying to make sense of that. And I couldn't really find anything in the medical literature that would explain that kind of radical shift in thinking, and that's when I started to realize, okay, this is just queer theory. This is activism.
Yeah. Can I just specify, just in case people are catching up, when you talk about the things that you are opposing or the things that you are fighting back against, these would be theories like early affirmation and principles like that are supposed to be, that the other side, shall we call them, are arguing are absolutely vital for trans youth, as they call it. It was that type of thing you were worried about.
Yeah, like for example, when I was learning how to do hormone readiness assessments, I mean, 15 years ago, that was a more slow and careful process. So that was the beginnings of the affirmation model. So I was probably among the first people that went through an affirmation model. But the affirmation model still allowed for thorough assessment to be done originally.
And
Um,
that's being swept aside, is it?
It it is, and there's one paragraph in the WPATH Standards of Care version 7 that talks about, because they still advocated for thorough assessment, especially for young people. They still recommended psychotherapy. They said they highly recommended, and that in many cases it can help a person not change gender dysphoria, but integrate that into an identity. Sort of like what I was talking about earlier, that a lot of gay and lesbian people just integrated that into what it meant to be gay or lesbian. So but there's this one paragraph in the WPATH Standards of Care that talks about a newer approach, which they called an informed consent model, and they said they named the Fenway Clinic as one of the first clinics to be doing this. And because of that, I think one paragraph, it's opened up this gateway for more and more clinics to start practicing that way, which means all we need is your informed consent. As long as I deem you capable of being able to understand the information I'm going to provide you, you don't have a major cognitive impairment that makes you unable to understand that information. So as long as we deem you capable of being able to consent, all I need you to do is sign a waiver and we'll start this treatment. So it's treatment being started in as little as, one appointment.
Yes, yes. And Scott Nugent, who's also in your group, he was telling me, oh God, he was saying that the complications that came from his surgery are partly because it's an absolute wild west at the moment for, shall we say, slightly dodgy surgeons and medical practitioners who are taking advantage of these kids' indoctrination into gender ideology.
Yeah, and because kids are no longer being taught that this is gender dysphoria and this is what it means, and here's the research about it, and there are different kinds of gender dysphoria, and you have different options. Like when we think about this as gender dysphoria, the options include things like being a butch lesbian and never identifying as trans. But the narrative now is saying that if you think you're trans, you're trans.
Yes.
And that there's sort of this single narrative of what that means, that we're all kind of the same, that are somehow our experience is all of that is the same, and we get to just decide that we're trans or that we're male or female, and once you've decided that, it's not for anyone else to challenge you or to question that or to question your motivations or anything else. So it's a very different way of thinking about the trans experience, that it's not just a treatment that we choose for severe dysphoria, that this is just somehow a type of personhood.
Yes, yes.
And presented to kids, as young as kindergarten in public schools, that there's a gender spectrum and there's G.I. Joe on one side and there's Barbie on the other side, and then plot yourself, somewhere along that spectrum. And really what's that saying to kids, that unless you're G.I. Joe or Barbie, you're somehow trans, you're somehow on this trans spectrum, which is a very different way of thinking about this.
Yes, yes. Would you say that it's almost as if dysphoria is not considered a condition now, that you need to be trans?
That's exactly what they're saying, is that you don't require gender dysphoria in order to be trans, that anyone that just thinks they're trans is trans, and not everyone experiences dysphoria. So they're reframing dysphoria to mean, well, you're just distressed about being trans.
Yes,
because of maybe a transphobic environment or internalized transphobia, but there's no actual condition that makes you trans.
Yes, yes. So you kind of joined this group with Scott Nugent, Book Angel, and a few others. What are the aims of the group?
So Scott and I have when we started this, had slightly different agendas. So his is really targeting childhood medicalization, not feeling that it's safe care, which I totally agree with. That in this particular environment of affirmation only or informed consent only, where a young person can just be started on lifelong medicalization in a 20-minute appointment, I agree that's not safe care, and that's not even care according to the WPATH standards of care. The president of WPATH is recently, on the 60 Minutes episode, I don't know if you saw the recent report on 60 Minutes,
No.
about, it was supposed to be an episode entirely on detransitioners, but they ended up
Oh,
changing
yes.
that and talking about the healthcare system in general for trans people. And the president of WPATH, who's currently involved in writing the new standards of care, was on there saying, like, she and a lot of her colleagues are concerned about this direction that things have taken, but are too afraid to say so.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I'm saying so, and yes, it's hard for me too, and I experience a lot of backlash from this as well. But if WPATH isn't willing to stand up and say this isn't safe care, and they're the ones writing the next standards of care, who is going to stand up and say this isn't appropriate, this isn't safe care? And it's not transphobic to say we want the safest care possible from both from a supports from a mental health perspective as well as the physical interventions. I'm not saying nobody should ever get to do that. I just think we need a safe system of care for people to do that successfully.
Well, isn't the problem also that the wider the umbrella, the trans umbrella, the more people it covers, the harder it would be for people with genuine dysphoria to get the care they need.
It's going to compromise. Yeah, you're right. It's going to compromise because we're going to see more and more detransitioners, and it is going to start to break down when it just becomes a free-for-all for any reason you can think of that someone might want to change sex is being permitted. I don't see that going well in the long term, and you're right. I think that's going to compromise care for people with genuine gender dysphoria who would actually benefit from those treatments.
So these all, I mean, you're a trans person. These all seem like very reasonable positions. They seem very thoughtful and humane. They seem to care both about trans people and people who aren't actually trans, those who might become detransitioners. What has been the reaction to your group?
The vast majority of the reaction has been very positive. We've had a lot of parents reach out concerned about the quality of care that their children are receiving. And a lot of those parents get dismissed and branded as, well, you're just a bigot who doesn't want to support your trans kid. And maybe that's true in some cases, but the parents that have reached out to me, I'm not picking up on any transphobia. I think they're just concerned that all it takes is a 20-minute appointment with a physician to be started on this pathway of lifelong medicalization, and not really taking what the parents' observations into account. So that's the criticism I'm hearing from the parents, and I have had clinicians reach out to me as well who are very supportive. But there has been a minority, very vocal, quite aggressive, angry cohort of people who want to cast me off as just being a blatant transphobe who experiences internal transphobia and just hates the trans community and is throwing them under the bus.
Yeah. Now, who has been doing this then in Canada? Are you able to say?
Yeah, there's one individual. I mean, on social media, I've had various comments, certainly since I started this work, but where this has now kind of come off of social media into the real world here, is an individual quite prominent in trans activism and has been for a number of years, named Morgane Oger, I believe is how her name is pronounced.
Okay.
And
Yes.
she's I'm learning is known all around the world for her activism, but also some of the bullying ways in which she goes about that activism. And
well,
so
we actually raised when I was on Twitter, we raised I think around $12,000 for Vancouver rape relief, which Morgane also tried to shut down because it couldn't allow males to use their services. So this is a real hardliner. What has Morgane been up to with you?
So Morgane was pulled into a conversation I was having with somebody on Twitter about Bill C6 here in Canada, which is our conversion therapy law that they're trying to pass. And it's very, very close to being passed here. And the individual on Twitter was saying that only a right-wing bigot would ever be opposed to that bill. So I jumped in and said, well, I'm neither of those things, and I do oppose. I oppose the wording of the bill. I think most people agree that conversion therapy is a barbaric practice, and I don't condone what we understand commonly as conversion therapy. I don't condone that in any way. But these bills that are being passed, if you really read the wording and look at them with a critical lens, they're very sneaky and deceptive wording. And our Canadian bill is worded in such a way that they're defining trans as gender identity. So any effort to change someone's gender identity would be a criminal act here in Canada. So a butch lesbian who has gender dysphoria, who doesn't identify as trans and doesn't want to transition, wouldn't be able to go to a counselor and get any help for gender dysphoria, because they're no longer even framing it that way. They're framing it as, this is your gender identity, and so if you identify as male, then you're male. So it's going to really limit ethical psychotherapy and conversations about gender dysphoria. We're no longer going to be able to treat gender dysphoria as a condition as it has been in the past. And most people don't realize that and are behind this, thinking, well, of course we don't support conversion therapy. So my efforts have been to adjust the wording of it.
Right, yeah. And this kind of push has been mirrored in countries all over the world. In Australia, there's a 12-year sentence, I think, for anyone who might suggest to a child that they're not actually trans, that they're just experiencing gender dysphoria, that might pass.
That's
for instance.
Right. That's right.
And it's the same kind of muddy wording and thinking all over the world, where the gay community is seen as a specific group of people, which it is, and the trans community is seen as a specific group of people, which it very much isn't. There's all sorts of different people who come under the umbrella trans. So it's a very, very different thing, and it's very dishonest to frame it as conversion therapy.
That's right. And so my buddies and I, and bringing in people like Buck Angel and Scott, is we're trying to, one of the things that we decided to do very recently, because we're all used to having certain conversations amongst our trans friends in private, and having a barbecue in the backyard or around the kitchen table. And that sounds so different from what these conversations sound like in public. And so we're just having those conversations and created a podcast and just letting people listen in on the kinds of conversations we normally have. But getting back to Morgane, just so we don't lose that thread. So when I was having this conversation on Twitter about this, Morgane was pulled into that conversation. And what I didn't realize is Morgane had a big role to play in Bill C6 and how that's worded. So we had a conversation initially on Twitter, and then I had a Zoom meeting with her about 2 hours, and it was a civil conversation at that point. I think we're coming from very different ideological places, but it was a civil conversation, and I thought at that point that that was over and done with. And then she messaged me on Twitter, I think it was like a couple of days later, where she questioned the fact that I signed a letter by the Women's Liberation Front to the UN.
Yes.
Not realizing that Morgane is also involved at the UN level in helping to write policy and international law regarding trans rights. And so she was angry that I had signed this letter, which she feels is interfering with what she's doing at the UN level, and was characterizing that as, WOLF is a hate organization that is targeting and advocating for harm to be done to trans women, and by aligning myself with WOLF, therefore I am that my organization is also a hate organization that's targeting the safety of LGBT people worldwide, and blocking efforts to reduce harassment and harm being done to LGBT people worldwide. So that's how she's characterizing and framing that letter, which I believe you were a signatory on that letter as well. That
Yes.
letter was saying that we oppose to a very specific ideological framework being used in writing international law regarding the LGBT community, which I agree with, and we probably all signed that for slightly different reasons and different concerns about that. But my concern about it as a trans person, knowing that queer theory has made my gender dysphoria worse, and seeing the impact of that activism, the way it's taken over the clinical world and is creating a very unsafe system of care for trans people. That was my reason for signing that letter, that I don't want those theories being written into international law, because it impacts my trans experience, and it's imposing an ideological framework onto how I'm supposed to be conceptualizing my own experience, and it's shaping the kind of clinical care that I can do to provide a safe system of care for these young people. But
Yes.
she's framing that as doing a harm to LGBT people worldwide. And so she went on social media, doxed me, posted my employer's contact information online, was saying that, a very thinly veiled threat that as a clinician, I was in conflict of interest. I no longer do work with young people, and I don't work I don't do trans care anymore. So there is no conflict of interest. When I started doing the activism work, I shifted my role so that I wouldn't be in conflict of interest, but she didn't know that. And basically saying that she was going to go after my career and my livelihood because I was doing harm in her mind to LGBT people worldwide, and posting this and framing it that way. So wasn't giving any detail on social media. She would just post on social media saying this individual was advocating for harm at the UN level. Wow. And therefore shouldn't be a practicing clinician.
Yeah.
When that was only on Twitter, that was bad enough, but she has gone to the media now and has started to target my career. The media contacted not only my employer, because I work for a nonprofit organization that is one branch of a national organization. They went to the national head office organization to say, what are you going to do about this?
Extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. I mean, this really is an incredible time when a trans person can be attacked in such a way by someone like Morgan. Had you warned your employers that this might be coming up? Did you prepare them at all?
That's the agreement I have with them. I mean, they're in no way involved in my activism, but they had asked that I just keep them in the loop about things that I was doing, and just so they wouldn't feel blindsided if they ever got an angry phone call or questions about the work that I'm doing. So I've been happy to do that and keep them in the loop. But I have concerns. I don't want to hurt the organization. I really value the work that they're doing. I think they do fantastic work. And I think that I do good work as a clinician as well. I just personally don't want to do trans care if I'm going to be forced to practice in a way that I don't feel is safe care. So I feel like I'm advocating for trans people and a safe system of care for trans people. And I think I just have a different ideological way of understanding what it means to be trans and what I consider safe care than Morgan does. And so to go after my employer, who has nothing to do with any of my activism, and to go after me as a clinician, I think is disturbing.
It's disgraceful. It's absolutely appalling. Do you what are you hoping to concretely achieve with the group? Have you got any plans set up over the next while? What are your immediate short-term aims?
In regards to Morgan specifically, we're still trying to decide that. I got to see what real world consequences, are going to happen, as far as my career and whatnot. So we're just trying to decide that, and trying to think it all through and decide, well, what is the most appropriate thing here, and so still to be decided. But in the meantime, as a group of trans men, partnering with Scott at Trey Voices and my organization here in Canada, putting our heads together and trying to take a unified stand, that this isn't just me with this like far off base outlandish way of thinking about this, that a lot of us think this way, and a lot of trans people think of their experience in similar ways that I am. This isn't, this far off or outlandish way of thinking. So we're going to try to support each other to get that message out.
Yeah. And I believe there's some kind of vote or something coming up on the 1st of August in the UN. Is that right? Do you know anything about this?
I haven't been following that very closely, no.
I'll post a link about it, because I think it's important that people write to the UN and tell them their concerns about the direction that all this is traveling. What can people do to support you, Aaron, and to kind of keep an eye out for you?
That's a good question, and that's kind of gonna it depends on how this starts to unravel. If my job is threatened, and that's what I face, then that's going to be a different course of action, I think. But following me on my Twitter account, for example, or following Gender Dysphoria Alliance Canada or Trey Voices, to stay in the loop. If we kind of have people at the ready that agree with and value the work that we're doing, just to be in touch with us, because as we need help, we'll announce it on social media, and it might be asking for letters of support or whatever that's going to look like moving forward. It would be fantastic to have people that are just kind of there and ready to help if needed.
Okay, well, in the short term, if you send me any links and ways to contact you that you have, okay, I'll post them under this video. But in the long term, will you come back sometime and just tell us how it's going and kind of fill us in on any developments?
Would love to.
Good. Okay. Yeah. Is there anything else before we go that you'd like to add?
I don't think so. It's really it's lovely to chat with you. Lovely that people are starting to have this conversation, and please know that a lot of trans people themselves are behind what you're doing and care about how all of this is unfolding. And so I just appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation with you and be a part of trying to shift people's thinking on this.
Well, I think like you, like me, I mean, we're both worried about the backlash that is going to come if these extremists keep being the loudest voices on it. So I really hope that we see more of you, Aaron, and more of your group. And I think it can only be good for both trans and non-trans people to get some adults in the room. So thank you very much for speaking to me today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, I will sign up, but stick around. I'll just have a quick word with you. Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. I will post a bunch of links below this, and yes, please support Aaron any way you can. Okay.